long before the Lincoln Highway, America's first cross-country road. Before the Transcontinental Railroad. Before covered wagons crossed the mountains and deserts of the Oregon Trail. This was the path west into the new frontier, the famed Erie Canal.
Flaps are open, generators are on.
Guys, line up!
We copy you down, Eagle.
For 2 centuries, they have journeyed on this water highway that has changed America like nothing before it.
It was really the gateway to the West.
It was a miracle marriage of engineering and labor, built by thousands of immigrants and connected the East with the West.
It is a very classic part of early America. The canal, in my opinion, opened up transportation from New York City to the Great Lakes. And from the Great Lakes, it just went farther west.
As far back as the 18th century, leaders knew the future was in the West. And canals could take us there. In Maryland, George Washington pushed for construction of the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal to link Washington, D.C. with Pittsburgh and the Ohio River. The C&O was only partly finished, and long after his death. But it was New York's Governor DeWitt Clinton that made the Erie Canal a reality. Clinton's Ditch, they called it. For 363 miles, mules pulled the canal boats from Albany on the Hudson River to Buffalo on Lake Erie, moving freight, transporting people, and creating dreams of life on the new frontier. Thousands and thousands poured into the rapidly developing Midwest and beyond. The canal was so busy, it paid for itself in just years, and almost immediately plans to enlarge the 40-foot wide channel were hatched.
The original one was only 40 foot wide, 4 foot deep, immediately too small. And then the second one, 7 foot deep, but 70 foot wide. Another big difference is the original canal had single locks, the second canal had double locks.
Today, we actually see the third iteration of the waterway, what's called the barge canal. It's still used today with drawbridges, giant locks and dams to level the water. Come summer, it's almost as busy as those early days. It's not uncommon to see live-aboard barges ply the waters, the ultimate vacation.
You move around at your own pace, and you can stop where you want to stop and when you want to stop. You can go at the speed you want to go at.
The canal always maintained this wonderful feeling of slowing down in times.
The canal has become a major source of recreation, both in and out of the water.
I tell people I bleed canal water. I'm often running up and down the canal. I've paddled the canal. I've paddled through the lock.
And the Erie Canal just seems like a very interesting place to visit.
It's like a real treat for me.
This is a great ride.
It's one of the premier bike rides in America as groups navigate the path once used by the mules.
Cities along the canal are a result of the canal. They're just wonderful old villages.
All kinds of little towns up and down the canal.
Kim McNulty from Pennsylvania and her mother are giving it a try and learning the nuance of the bridges, made famous years ago in the song about Sal the Mule.
I've got an old mule and her name is Sal, 15 years on the Erie Canal.
Who knew cruising under a bridge would make for so much nostalgia?
Low bridge, everybody down. Low bridge, we must be getting near a town.
Seeing the lift bridges and going through the locks is such a unique experience, and to be in the water and witness them is really neat. We are on the Onondaga, that's the name of our vessel. So then we would identify ourselves and then tell them that we are seeking passage. The bridge will start to go up, and there's a red light on the bridge, and once the light turns green, you proceed under. You let them know when you're clear of the bridge, and they say they'll radio ahead to the next lift.
Ironically, the barge canal moved the channel away from some of the cities created by the original canal. In Albany, just Just a sign, and the bike path tells you where the canal first entered the Hudson. In Syracuse, the first canal was paved over, covered by Erie Street. A replica boat in the Erie Canal Museum marks the exact spot boats would stop to pay tolls.
Bring your boat into this area. It works the same way as a lock. They could drain the water out, and the boat would rest on this huge scale, which could weigh your boat. They'd weigh you at the beginning of the year empty. You'd get assessed a toll on everything the boat was carrying.
In Rochester, the Court Street Bridge is now high and dry. The old photos show when it was actually an aqueduct where the boats crossed over the Genesee River. All changes brought by progress of the canal. But success of the canal was a nightmare for the Native Americans, pushed aside from their own lands.
Some of the untold stories about the canal, what this did in dispossessing the Haudenosaunee, the native indigenous people who did not have a positive idea about the canal. We were trying to tell the true story, the good, the bad, the ugly.
Yet it turned New York into the Empire State, and in a few short years fueled an economic surge across America. Now, 200 years later, in the big cities and small towns created by the canal, these are just some of the people working to remember 200 years of Clinton's Ditch. At Chittenango Landing, they have preserved 3 old dry docks used in the early days of the canal. Here, hundreds of boats were repaired. And you can see some of the old stonework that frames the canal in dramatic style. In Camillus, the halfway point across New York, volunteers have restored an old aqueduct where the canal flowed over a creek.
We have the first and second versions of the Erie Canal on the property and the only restored aqueduct from the first enlargement here. 200 boats a day went right through here.
In Port Byron, they have preserved old walls from the locks. You could walk right through. The indents were once filled by giant oak gates.
Port Byron was put on the map because of Clinton's Ditch, one of the towns that grew.
And an actual saloon has been restored on the banks of the canal. The historic canal schooner Louis McClure is being moved to be put on display. In Lockport, they have rebuilt the old locks and worked them by hand, pushing tons of history to tell the story in dramatic demonstrations.
Our primary focus of our Lockport Locks Heritage District has been to restore and to return to operating condition our Erie Canal flight of 5 locks.
From inside these working locks, you really get a sense of what life on the old canal would have been like.
The gates are to the original design, all white oak. They were built from drawings that the State Archives had.
Here, you get a remarkable demonstration of how the old locks worked.
The volunteers will pull the boat back through into the next chamber above us. The gates will close again, and then we'll allow water from up above to flow into the next chamber above us to elevate the boat back up 12 feet so that it can then go into the other chamber above that.
And they have installed a powerful sculpture by artist Susan Geisler to honor the lock tenders that ran the gates in the 1800s. With each sweep of the crane, hundreds of pounds of bronze go flying through the air. The blanket's just a little extra protection.
They're all working well together and they're communicating. I like it.
Oh, things are going smooth. Smooth as butter.
Like everything on the Erie Canal, it's a great story. This one crafted by an entire community coming together to honor their past, to honor the workers that ran the canal. A single photograph captured more than 120 years ago is all that's left.
The photograph that F.B. Clinch made, portrait photographer here in Lockport.
An 1897 photograph that was taken of lock tenders sitting on the steps.
Very powerful image.
This stretch, known as the Flight of 5, was particularly tough. The boats moved through 5 sets of back-to-back locks to climb the escarpment, this cliff that created the nearby Niagara Falls. It stood right in the way of the canal as it neared Lake Erie to the west.
The lock tenders at the time was a one-man operation here. They paid the lock tenders $1 a day.
It was backbreaking work. It was hard work. I mean, it was all manual to move those gates.
So as the years went by, the Lockport Locks Heritage District and other groups took on the daunting task of raising the money to create the monument. Geisler was chosen because of a tradition of doing historic sculptures. In Lewiston, New York, she created the Freedom Crossing Monument that tells the courage of fugitive slaves fleeing north on the Underground Railroad and local volunteers that snuck them to Canada.
Cross the Niagara River right over to Canada to experience freedom for the first time in their lives.
In the faces, we see fear, yet hope.
This monument is very powerful. It shows a lot of history that sometimes we don't know about or don't talk about.
So this is such of a blessing, so I love it.
Some people come here and they're in tears when they see the expressions on the faces.
We see the story of America.
They're bursting with hope.
The good and the bad. So the work begins.
I take the photograph, isolate each character, I draw a grid on it. Then I draw a grid on a piece of paper so I can see what I'm making. And in the grid from the photograph, I draw the image. And then from that, I cut the dimensions, the styrofoam that I've glued together, draw the grid on that, draw the clothing on it, start cutting it. I put a thin layer of the clay on it first, and then I sculpt it.
As this goes on, she is constantly melting more clay, adding the layers, mapping out each figure.
I put his collar on, and he has a tie, and I'll have a grid on here too.
It's all about the detail.
And the eyes are the most important thing, and the hands, and the shoes, because I'm a shoe freak. I like shoes, so that's important. The hands are as expressive. It's your second, I think, most expressive thing when people are talking. Hands, you know, first the eye contact. The eyes are the window to their soul, and they really have to connect.
So day after day, year after year, the clays, as she calls them, take shape. The faces appear. And while she worked, others asked the question, just who were these workers in the photograph?
It was going to anchor the sculptures to the community if you could actually identify who they were and find out who was related to them.
Jeff Degnan was tasked with the daunting investigation.
A whole lot of research. Old newspapers, Ancestry.com, that's marriage certificates, death certificates, obituaries.
With each new name, a piece of the puzzle fell into place. Fred Wagner, Edward O'Hara, Martin Noonan, John Leonard, Edwin Barrett, and the investigation continues. Susan's husband, Pete, now takes over, running the finished clays to the foundry.
Susan's truck driver, that's me.
But this is no simple crosstown trip. It's a 1,500-mile journey as he loads them in a truck and races west to Loveland, Colorado. Everyone asks, why Colorado?
We began to develop some relationships with the foundries out here, of which there are many.
This community at the base of the Rocky Mountains has become a hub of bronze artwork, and he's done this trip nearly 40 times over the years. First stop, the mold maker. Just getting them unloaded and undamaged is a tense process. Their special mounts, built to mimic the steps of the canal, are unscrewed from the floor of the truck.
All right. One safe landing.
Crews begin to split the clays into pieces.
The pieces will be cut up, the hats, legs. The foundry does, this particular one, 24-inch panels.
After they are cut and mapped out in sections, they begin to spray on layers of the rubber molding. The sculptures look like they are coated in ice, and make no mistake, everything has to be perfect.
If the first process, like the mold, isn't done correct, then all the steps along the way are more difficult and cost more. And in the end, the piece may not look like the original. So each step, each one also is an art in itself.
From here, the molds head to a foundry. A reverse ceramic impression is made. That, in turn, is covered in wax. It's a large army making all this happen. Here at Bronze Services in Loveland, it all comes together.
And in any given one piece, we'll probably have 18 people touch that piece.
At this point, the artwork is at the wax stage.
So many parts to the process from start to finish, and the original sculpture doesn't stay in one piece. For instance, here's just a hand of one of the workmen.
Susan comes west to inspect the work. The wax chasing, as they call it, fixing flaws, is slow, delicate work, very nearly the touch of a surgeon. Ethan has been fixing the joints and other small details.
We're usually left with these seams from where the mold's connected, and my job is pretty much to go through and get rid of those seams. So I'll fill it with wax and then kind of scrape it down with these tools.
Others add the plumbing to the work. The molten bronze will basically be fed down these tubes.
The bronze is going to go down bottom and it's going to fill all the way up to the top. And this is some of the plumbing that I put in. This cup gets put on the top and the bronze gets poured down this cup, goes all the way to the bottom of the bar.
Once the wax work is done, they are covered several times with a ceramic coating that will create a reverse mold. This will be the chamber the molten bronze is poured into.
And the canal artwork really comes to life here.
They slowly lift the crucible out of the blast furnace. The ceramic molds are pulled out of a hot kiln. In here, the wax is melted away. The ceramic molds, without wax, are lowered into sand. The 2,000-degree molten bronze is maneuvered into position, and the pour begins. This is the head of one of the lock tenders, Frank LaValle.
What about the lock tenders? How does that sit in your heart?
It's very important because of the history part of it. We're trying to make it human.
Absolutely.
And so the little human touches on them, that really is what makes this.
They move the molds to a cooling rack. Within an hour, the hammers go to work, chipping away the coating. And there is Frank again.
It's a wonderful moment, and it's going to be a wonderful heritage tribute for centuries.
These are the real faces, the people that kept the canal running.
Very powerful image. It's become an icon for Lockport. It's a moment in time that's never forgotten.
Out comes the champagne.
Cheers, salute.
The toasts. The hugs. And the words of thanks.
Hey! Thank you, everybody. Thank you to everybody. Thanks for asking me to do the project.
And the group photo, just a part of the team that made it all happen.
It's going to be a wonderful heritage tribute for centuries.
It's a very emotional time.
We've been so fortunate to have an artist who brings so much talent to a project like this. She clearly has an incredible sensitivity, not only to each of the individual figures that she's crafted, but also to the story of the Lockport lock tenders and the story of the Erie Canal.
Think about the creativity of this lady bringing this history to life for us here in Lockport. That's awesome.
Almost immediately, kids of all ages discover the joy of the Lock Tenders Monument, just made for social media.
Hello, Edward.
He looked like my grandpa. The people just love coming over here and getting their picture taken with them, sitting up next to them. It's great.
And the descendants of the Lock Tenders come to see the finished work. Carrie Foster has brought her father, Hugh, and mother, Shelby Barrett.
Great-grandfather.
He is my great-great-grandfather.
And while none of them ever met Edwin, he died before Hugh was born, this family can all tell us something about him.
He didn't have far to come to work. He only lived about 2 blocks from here.
When this picture was taken, he was a whole 50 years old, and he was the old man.
The first time I saw the statue was on the back of the truck when they were bringing it in, and I said to my husband, I said, look, you either have his nose or he has your nose.
And now I can come down here and say, that's my great-great-grandfather. kind of make people jealous.
In the weeks following, 60 direct descendants have come here, preserving this history. With the Erie Canal success, canals were built in all sorts of places, creating something of a network. So you could travel from New York through Ohio and Indiana onto the big rivers, down the Mississippi, all the way to New Orleans. But while the Erie still flows, most other canals are just short little sections of navigable water. The C&O in Maryland, the Lehigh in eastern Pennsylvania, Metamora and Delphi, Indiana, Canal Fulton, Ohio, in their own ways preserving American canal history.
Shows them how things were done long ago.
Metamora has the only covered bridge aqueduct, so the Whitewater Canal crosses a creek in dramatic style. In Washington, D.C., they have rebuilt a canal boat, and you can ride it through a working lock in Georgetown and upstream see other canal sections preserved.
The original idea of the canal was to take advantage of the Ohio River Valley. It was one step in connecting the waterways from the East Coast to those of the Midwest.
At the Johnson Farm and Indian Agency Park in Piqua, Ohio, the mules will pull you through a short section of the Miami and Erie Canal.
This site is a great draw because people get to come and actually ride on the canal boat and see what life was like in the 1800s.
And a new boat is running on the old Wabash and Erie Canal in Indiana, once the longest canal in America. In eastern Pennsylvania, they have restored a section of the old Lehigh Canal. Percheron mules pull the Josiah White about 2.5 miles as you learn how the canal transported coal that powered the Industrial Revolution. Before the canals, wagons were pretty much the only way to move freight over the mountains. Not far from Easton, the famed Conestoga wagons were born. In Lancaster, Pennsylvania, Arthur Reist owns 5 of the historic wagons, including this one that was in Valley Forge with General George Washington. But were so heavy, the trip over the Appalachian Mountains was a real challenge. But back to New York. And in Buffalo, everyday people have turned into boat builders for the celebration. They are finishing work on the new Seneca Chief.
We're exceptionally proud of this boat. It gave us a sense of purpose and a sense of community.
It's just been a labor of love for all of us.
A replica of the first boat that journeyed from Buffalo to Albany and New York City to mark the opening of the canal in the autumn of 1825. Some 200 volunteers with the Buffalo Maritime Center have been working for years building the new boat.
I like working with my hands. I'm retired now, and I've had some experience restoring boats. I've restored Adirondack guide boats.
Been a woodworker for close to 50 years. There's 2 master boat builders here. They both tell us what needs to be done, and everybody's got a different skill set, so.
On board the original trip, dignitaries included Governor DeWitt Clinton, whose insistence, whose pure force of personality, basically created the canal.
They went down to New York. Clinton was on board, other prominent officials. It became a real triumph for Clinton and his administration and for the whole idea of the canal.
Clinton brought barrels of Lake Erie water to dump into the Hudson, the Wedding of the Waters, they called it.
A huge event. We're reenacting that.
In the fall of 2025, they will take the same trip, stopping in 28 cities and towns along the canal, ending up in New York City.
Seemed like an easy idea to think of at that time. We'll do the Wedding of the Waters. Now that has turned into an enormous event with all the complexity of running the Barnum and Bailey Circus. It's very significant, a community project for Buffalo, helping Buffalo recapture its identity as really the Queen City of the lake, where actually the East Coast met the Midwest. It was really the gateway to the West.
Construction on the new boat began in 2020 in full public view. Inside the long shed along the Buffalo River, hundreds of volunteers toiled. It was in this spot the original canal ended. You can still see remnants of the old buildings. The area, now called Canal Side, has brought a renewed sense of pride to the city, where the annual boat parade celebrates the Bills and Buffalo's connection to the water. At the boat's core, a piece of very old wood donated to the team.
The keelson is the piece that runs the longitudinal axis of the boat,
and ties all these ribs together. They had it in the warehouse for over 90 years. The tree had to be well over 100 years to grow to that length. You add the 90 plus the 100, and you're back in the days when the canal was actually being dug.
The volunteers are on a hard deadline to finish the work so the boat can be moved to Lockport, where it will spend the winter.
One of the challenges is there's not a square board on this boat, so you got to cut it to fit.
We'll pull out backwards.
By early October of 2024, the team gathers again, along with students from St. Mary's School of the Deaf, many who helped work on this boat as part of their curriculum. They cast off. They slowly walk the boat down the dock. The historic tug C.L. Churchill is fired up and moves into the river. Ever so carefully, the Seneca Chief is positioned. It has no power itself. The tug pulls up. They're lashed together.
Churchill, the tug which is carrying the boat on the hip just aft of the center of the boat, which is pretty easy to guide it that way. We also have another little boat called the scoocher. We're actually building a specific wooden boat for that purpose, which helps to kind of guide it and steer it a little bit because it's 73 feet long. So there's a lot of windage and a lot of other issues when you're trying to manipulate something like that in narrow waters.
The flotilla takes off north up the Buffalo River. Back in the day, this spot was thick with canal barges. Now, like back then, it's a slow, steady pace, not unlike the days the mules would do the towing. It slides out of the harbor, then into the chop, where the Buffalo River joins the Niagara River. Yet, it's smooth running.
It's an incredibly stable boat. When you have two boats tied together, it's a little bit more stable as well. I think it might be different if they were separate. It was a very calm day today, so we didn't have any trouble going through at all.
A short time later, the Seneca Chief slips under the bridges of Tonawanda.
It's going well. These guys are heading on out to Lockport so we can put the Erie Canal boat Seneca Chief to bed for the winter.
The main reason for doing that is it's a wooden boat. You want to keep the boat moist. You don't want it to dry out, to start to leak. So it gets enough moisture in there.
Back in the day, many a canal barge would winter on the canal. Families ran and lived right on the boats.
Generations of families lived on this canal. Your parents' job was to get as close as possible to a town with a store or a school in November, and then you'd freeze into the ice.
The Seneca Chief will make its 200th anniversary journey right before winter, but so far, passengers rave about the experience.
It was wonderful. I taught at St. Mary's School for the Deaf and sailed tall ships for 17. So this is a fun trip for me.
It was absolutely beautiful. I mean, this is also a historic moment, quite the adventure.
She's spot on about the history, because as Buffalo grew, the terminus of the canal was moved here, feeding into the Tonawanda River. Raw materials poured in, and mills and factories sprang up on this very waterfront, making it the largest lumber port in the world. It created thousands of jobs. The Herschel Carousel factory sprang up just blocks from the port.
That company had built the factory here because of its location to the Erie Canal.
It's a museum now, showing how they build many of the classic carousels that were all the rage at the turn of the century. The wooden animals carved right in here.
The horses were carved with chisels and using a mallet. And the ingenuity that was put in there just kind of blows my mind to think that way back 100 years ago, these people had these minds that were just way ahead of their time.
You can still watch volunteers using the old chisels and mallets, keeping the art alive. And it was all because of the canal.
There were over 13 lumber mills that were within a mile of where the museum factory now stands. So all the lumber would be processed there, and then these little companies would pop up nearby that would use this lumber.
Here's the music.
Here you can watch and hear the old band organs. Just like early computers, they could make all the sounds of a full band. All of this would have been shipped out on the canal boats. So when the Seneca Chief makes its special trip in the fall of '25, It'll celebrate all these small towns and big cities born on the banks of the Erie Canal. Tell the story of immigrants on the move, chasing new opportunities and big changes for a young country. Because out here, they are saving Americana, remembering the days of the canals, when the slow, steady tug of the mules on the towpath took a nation into the new frontier.